While surging inflation has caused the consumer sentiment to slump, January retail sales report remains strong. Do you think that the retail reading has reflected the inflation reality?
U.S. households are in a good financial position in the aggregate. But if you look in the aggregate and what's going to sustain consumer spending, there are enough other workers who've had good job gains and they have increasing wealth, whether it's from investments or their housing wealth, that the U.S. consumer, willing and able to spend, ready to spend to support the U.S. economy. And this is again in contrast to some of the past recessions where economic activity collapsed because households were weak. It was an outside shock from the pandemic. Now, what went on with the January numbers? Yes, you're seeing e-commerce and brick and mortar retail both with a solid foundation, and U.S. consumers spending in both categories.
To what extent are you concerned about the inflation?
I'm concerned about inflation because quite often economic performance deteriorates, and you can see a really bad economic outcome in a high inflationary environment, partly because inflation can hurt consumer buying power, it can distort business decisions, but most importantly, if the Federal Reserve acts aggressively to combat the inflation, it can slow the economy and sometimes it's push the economy into a recession. How is this similar to those previous episodes? I mentioned the 1970s and the 1960s as well, was high inflation in the US. The basic economic fundamentals in terms of the business health, the financial position of households, the banking system, is much, much stronger than we had seen in the past. The inflation numbers still look like a pandemic shock. The Consumer Price Index reports separately for goods inflation and services inflation. The goods inflation is most likely temporary, supply pipeline bottleneck causing price spikes. We'll get through those. It's more concerning to see service inflation if that's wage pressures going up. The services inflation actually slowed over the past 2 years. Given that we're not seeing wage pressures causing service inflation that could be self-sustaining, it's mostly from goods, and the Fed seems to recognize that. I do think we're going to have a safe landing from this. Whether it's the second half of this year or early next year is uncertain.
Do you see the price pressure ease significantly in the year ahead?
We need to see the timing of the supply chain improving. And that includes not just in the US, but shipping overseas and also production in Asia. We still rely on China, on other Asian countries for a lot of the production of the goods that Americans like to buy. Question for the outlook is how quickly do all the links in the production and supply chain come back online? Very few people anticipated a year ago that the supply chain bottlenecks would become this severe. It makes me pause before I say I expect them to ease fairly quickly. We are seeing signs that the ports are getting the goods through faster. We are seeing signs that delivery times are shortening. We're seeing a lot of signs that the recovery in the supply chain is underway, and one would hope that that would take place by the second half of this year. But the risk here is that it's going to take longer, in which case the inflation pressures could well linger into the second half of this year, even into 2023.